Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Vox Pop. We're at episode 11 now of Vox Pop, and this week we are speaking to Ronan Maher, who is editor of the Samizdat Magazine. Many of you will know of him, or may know him an awful lot better than you know me, so I don't think you'll need much in the way of introduction. Ronan, hello.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for having me and for the very generous introduction. I'm not sure how many people will know who I am, but anyway, thank you for having me.
Well, pleasure. No, you'd be surprised. I think if you do anything, and I know you're pretty active in terms of what you're doing, and vocal, and I've heard you on a few other podcasts or seen your magazine and what have you, then I think you'd be amazed how many people do take notice. So don't be too humble. We've had a little interaction on Twitter, which tends to be the way that all these things start for me, given that I'm not quite there with Joe Rogan in terms of publicists contacting me. And we had a little chat about a few things. So first thing I wanted to just touch on, Samizdat. So I did have to look up what that meant, and I do now know what it meant. But what does Samizdat stand for? What's the what's the tagline to it? Let's put it that way. You've got a tagline underneath, haven't you?
Veritatis simplexa ratio est. The language of truth is simple. It's obviously a Latin phrase. Refers to unadorned speech. I believe that. Language, we believe, it's not just myself, there are a few of us involved, and we all agree that things need to be truth. It needs to be stated plainly and simply, and not dressed up. If it's dressed up, it muddies the waters, makes people suspicious, and also the other way around, lies are often dressed up to disguise them. Speak plainly and write plainly. Yeah.
It'll never catch on. Never catch on.
I think it will. The magazine itself, Samizdat, is a Russian word meaning self-published. In the wake of Stalin's death, a lot of writing, literature, poetry, journalism that was previously unavailable to people started to be distributed, and it was called Samizdat. I think that it speaks to constraints on free speech and free expression in general in our own time in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's very pertinent at the moment, isn't it? I mean, I think anybody listening to this must surely be aware of what's happening in the media at the moment, and the unilateral, and in politics as well. I mean, we seem to have a uniparty supported by one media, and everybody is in lockstep, which is probably a phrase which is, that's probably no accident that I use that phrase. But well, I think what you're doing it should be very welcome. Is it online only, or do you do online and a physical copy, or how does it work?
So we're on to the fourth issue now. The first 3 issues were PDF only.
Right.
Now, obviously, it would be great if at some point we could have a physical copy on the shelves, but we don't want to get ahead of ourselves to see how things go. But we are now shifting direction to a slightly more traditional online magazine format, if that's the correct term. I think it probably is at this point. So we don't want to have barriers between readers and content. I want it to be available as quickly and easily as possible. And the medium that we'd used, the PDF, was novel. No one else is doing it. We like it, but nevertheless, it puts up barriers. People go to the website, they have to submit details that in this day and age, perhaps they don't feel comfortable submitting, understandably. So yeah, we're going to be shifting imminently in the next week or two to a much more direct online magazine, where the articles will be free and available for everyone to read. And then going forward, we'll have a separate section on the website for members, people who want to donate a small amount of money a month to help support us. We haven't got corporate funding or anything like that.
Yep.
And none of us are independently wealthy enough to just do it for free in the long run. But the main content will be available, nevertheless, for everyone to read.
Right, good. Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, I think accessibility to start with. It seems to be that the way forward with all these things is you've got to. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but you've got to build a following, a readership, and a sort of a customer base, I suppose, and then from that, people will generally, I think, are more minded to support and get involved, and things like, I don't know, forums and just generally helping to support the project. It becomes a little bit easier, but you've got to get a certain number of people, haven't you, really, before you can get a percentage of those people that are committed, and then it all starts to work. But seems to be a relatively modern phenomenon, which works well with podcasts as well. If you do people like, the likes of Joe Rogan, who obviously he is the sort of the most eminent podcaster in the world, probably, but he's just sold to Spotify for 160 million quid, which gives you some idea of how much reach somebody like Spotify thinks that Joe Rogan must have. And I mean, he does millions and millions and millions of listens every week. So no, it all makes sense. I think it's great to see somebody like you and somebody, if you like, on our side of the fence, actually trying to put something up which is, as you say, simple and truthful rather than spun, which seems to be the way that the media has gone over the last 15 years or so, in my experience anyway. Now, you also share something in that Third Wednesdays, which is something that I think Dick Dellingpole set up a couple of years ago, and was originally called Libertarian Drinks, from memory. You've just set one up recently, have you not, in the Northwest?
Yeah, on Wednesday night we had the third edition in Mobberley, which is near Knutsford in Cheshire. A pub there called Railway Inn. I'm going to give a shout out for them. They've been great, fantastic venue. The people that run it are, broadly speaking, on our side, which goes a long way to making the night very comfortable and relaxing for people.
Yep.
We've had attendees from all over the country, Sheffield, Wales, further down south than that, people have driven up. It's been fantastic. Great atmosphere, a sense of freedom where you can express, opposition to the dominant state ideology, which prevails in most other pubs up and down the country, it would seem. Yeah,
I mean, it does seem at the moment that the ability for people to speak their minds is a narrowing window, which can't be good for anybody, can it? But I think it's a fantastic idea that I think Dick was instrumental in setting up. I say Dick, I don't.
Dick was certainly having to stress that to people quite a lot, because I find them coming up to me and saying, "Oh, you set this up. You set this third Wednesday up." I said, "Well, no, it's just a kind of small franchise, really. No, there's no money exchange or anything like that. But it was Dick's thing, and he suggested on Twitter that I set one up in the north, and I think it's to him we must be grateful for it. I think it's 13 chapters now, including one on the east coast of Ireland in Wicklow.
No, it's amazing. I talk about this as though I know a lot about it. I bumped into Dick once, well before I knew anything about Third Wednesdays. Briefly, I don't know him, although we've spoken on Twitter a few times. I am planning, because I live in Worcestershire, I am planning to go to the local Third Wednesday down here. Probably it's going to be December because of what I do and being away and stuff. But and then I would like to go around some of the others. I think it's a great idea to just build a network, really, and get to know different names and faces and people that you speak to on social media and what have you. But
absolutely,
no, I think that's great. So okay, so we've got that in common. Although, as I say, I've not yet even been, so I won't take the I won't take any credit for actually participating.
You should. I went to before I started the one in Mobley the month before. I went to one in Ledbury, which is not far from Worcestershire, is it?
That's the one I'd go to, I think. Yeah.
Right. And it was a great night. Helped that it's extremely beautiful setting and the sun was shining, and it's that countryside is stark contrast from the urban area where I live. So it was great anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it would be. I live out sort of rural Worcestershire, so it's a bit of a. It's not that bad to get to, but it is a bit of a cross country hike. But it's certainly no desperate hardship. So I'm looking. It used to be in centre of Worcester, which was probably a 15-minute taxi journey for me, which would have just meant that I didn't have to think about driving. But that's I can live with that. So we had a chat on Twitter earlier in the week. It's obviously been a pretty horrendous 7 days, really. Every 7 days recently seems to have its challenges, but obviously the big thing in the news has been the vicious murder of Sir David Amess, which happened, I think, exactly a week ago, doesn't it? It was on last Friday. Which I was I suppose one of the reasons it perhaps shook everybody a little bit was because we haven't had an obvious, or I don't think we've had an obvious alleged terror attack for quite a while, have we? The news cycle seems to have been taken up largely by what's happening with lockdowns and vaccinations and everything else. Am I missing something, or I don't think there's been too much, has there?
I think that's debatable. I think that's debatable. There was, for example, a man on Oxford Circus some months back murdered in a random stabbing by the media reported it as a Swansea man to begin with. It was only when it came to court that it was revealed that this Swansea man required an interpreter, and he had an Ethiopian name. Right. Now that disappeared extremely quickly. We never found out how it was that this man came to be living in Swansea, or at the time of his arrest, I think he was of no fixed abode. His last address prior to the murder was Swansea. Was that a terror attack with a random stabbing in the street? Well, there have been other incidents in recent years that we can all probably call to mind quite easily that were random stabbings in the streets of citizens, and in the aftermath called terrorist attacks. So I don't know. Obviously, it's more obviously a terrorist attack when a politician is murdered, because of course terrorism often has an ideological, political component to it, or by definition it does rather. So I don't know. Maybe there haven't, but at the very least, I think it's true to say there haven't been any high-profile ones.
Yes, and I think, I mean, I didn't know. I didn't even recognise his face when he was on the media, but he's obviously been in Parliament a long time. I think he was one of the leading sort of poster boys of Thatcher when Thatcher was in power in the 80s and 90s. So, and he's obviously got a knighthood, so he's clearly been part of the parliamentary establishment for a good period of time. He seems, not that this matters when it's somebody's murdered, but it does seem like he seems to be one of the good guys in terms of he was actively participating in regularly in constituency surgeries and things like that, which I think a lot of MPs probably try and avoid. So it makes it even more tragic, really, that the fact that he was trying his best to involve members of the public and do his duty as an MP, and then he then gets brutally murdered. I'm sure I'm not alone in, I think probably, we haven't talked about this, that you share my frustrations, we'll see. The way that it was reported, I mean, obviously they knew who it was straight away, but nobody said anything for several hours. but he was on scene. The murderer was on scene, so it was pretty obvious who it was. But then the way that the media are so desperate, it's so obvious to me that they're so desperate not to say, as it now turns out, that he's a Muslim, or recognises as a Muslim. So the media why are they so desperate not to mention this on every single event? If it's a white chap from South Wales who runs people down on the pavement, his description and photograph is on the front page and on the TV within 20 minutes of it happening. It seems to be my experience. And yet, if it's a Muslim, all of a sudden it all has to be played down. And why do you think that is? What's your take on that? If you think it is, perhaps you don't. But
so I can only speculate, as we all can, I think. I feel the same as you. I share your frustrations. I remember texting a couple of friends and messaging a couple of friends on Twitter on Friday as events unfolded, and saying, it seems obvious to me that the media is, and by the media I mean prominent journalists at the Times, the Guardian, the Telegraph, the BBC, Sky, and all the rest, the mainstream media, that they were talking endlessly about David Amos, and some of them knew him, and that's therefore sort of understandable. They were talking endlessly about him and never discussing the attacker. They were not mentioning the attacker or why this might have occurred. That for me was a strong indication, as I expressed to friends, that it was a Muslim that had done it.
Yeah.
Now, it later transpired that very early on, I think it was a local reporter, said that an African-looking man was seen being put into a car. Now, you must have a throat clearing here. Doesn't mean that all African-looking people are Muslims, or any other nonsense that anyone might come out with, who's listening to this and is an ideological progressive. But in this day and age, if someone of that description is involved in an incident like what came to pass, probability tells you that it was probably a Muslim. There's no getting away from it. It's extremely uncomfortable to talk about, but we have to talk about it because it's true. It's a general truth. As to why they're quiet about it, I think they're scared of Islam. They're scared of being called racists, even though Islam is not a race. They're scared of confronting this enormous and growing problem in our society. So they'll talk about anything else instead, because it was in stark contrast, wasn't it? I don't know if you remember, Sam, the murder of Joe Cox, which they've been reminding us about in recent days, endlessly. I believe that's also.
They were reminding us about that. Her name was actually, somebody did a count and said that her name was mentioned more on the day of Sir David Amos's murder than his name, which is outrageous. Yes, I know what you're going to say. I wasn't here actually in the UK at the time, so I missed it. But I have been briefed on it. My brother told me something about it.
They in the hours after the murder, they were very eager to shine a light on Tommy Maher. They were very eager to do that. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done that. I just think it's worth noting that the response was in contrast to the response to what happened on Friday. And the reason, by the way, for talking about Joe Cox endlessly in the last few days, I believe, is because they want to ensure the connection in the public mind between random stabbings of MPs and the so-called far right is not broken by this event.
Well, I actually totally agree with you, although I think there's probably some people that are who are not don't follow this or aren't into politics much or anything else would probably go, they could. I think they might think that sounded a little bit conspiratorial, but I totally agree with you. It seems clear to me that every opportunity is taken to try. I mean, the reaction of the media and the politicians, largely conservative politicians, has not been, we've got a domestic problem with homegrown Islamic radicals, even though we've got decades now of proof of this. It was, we need to stop all this nasty talk on Twitter, and close down discussion, and then a reference to incels as well, and which again is linked to far right, all these nasty toxic white men in their basements, all disenfranchised and shouting at MPs, and the inference was that they're the problem.
Never mind all the radical socialists, neckbeards who can't get laid and dwell in their mother's basements.
Exactly. It's so. I mean, I suppose you could argue, say, well, you're white, and I am also single, so I suppose people could go, well, you're only sensitive to it because it's too close to home. But I'm probably a bit old to be an incel. But it just seems obvious to me that there is and it's not just me. I was just listening this afternoon, funnily enough, to a recent Spiked episode, and they were saying pretty much exactly the same thing, that there is this constant go-to narrative. We've got to stay away from, we can't touch Islam, we can't touch the obvious elephant in the room, which is this largely radicalized young Islamic men, or men that, follow this particularly, I was going to say extreme, but probably literal is probably better, sort of Old Testament view, if you like, of their religion, to use a Christian analogy. So, no, it drives me nuts, and it's so annoying because until we talk about it, how are we ever going to resolve it? I mean, what's your view on MPs' protection? Because that's featured quite a lot this week as well, on MPs getting close protection, etc.
Two things. One, I think MPs should have security. We can't have MPs getting hacked up. That's not in anyone's interests. But secondly, what about protection for us? And actually, I'll add a third thing to that. Why don't we start looking at what it is they need protecting from?
Yeah.
And what it is that we need protecting from. It seems very odd to me that they're discussing security matters while we have de facto open borders with the Islamic world. Yeah. It would seem to be, imagine a homeowner in the front room discussing security to keep the burglars out while the back doors are wide open. It seems mad.
Well, everything nowadays, this last couple of years in particular, has been pretty mad. But I don't know if you've had chance yet, but I did speak to Steve Laws last week.
He's the guy who reports on the channel invasion, and
So he's, he's sort of a citizen journalist, I suppose. He was on Talk Radio a little while ago, and then because he was on Talk Radio, he got jumped upon very quickly by Hope Not Hate, who then desperately tried to deplatform him and paint him as a raving racist. He's a very laid-back guy. I spoke to him, and he was, I'm sure he doesn't enjoy it, but he was kind of fairly resigned to how he was going to be dealt with. But he did get a hearing, and I think he and some of his colleagues that do a similar thing have probably been pretty instrumental in drawing people's attention to what's happening down there. I think in the public now, there's probably quite a strong, anger, actually, or certainly frustration at what's happening on the coast. Whereas I don't think people were necessarily aware of it until the last 12 months. But he's done a lot, and he was saying now that there's something like, he told me something like 25,000 people had come in through Dover and the beaches this year alone. I saw a figure on Migration Watch saying it was 30,000 people. And when you look at the photographs, they're nearly all young men of fighting age, which doesn't mean that they're all going to fight, but it does mean that there's potentially a threat there. So I think, yes, I don't know where I was going with that, other than that it's clearly not like we're two paranoid people in the middle of the UK worrying about this. It is happening out there. And as you say, the back door is open. People are just wandering through. There was a time, wasn't there, when we had the lockdown, where the only people that were leaving this country and coming in were either wealthy businessmen or people that had no passports or proof of identity walking on the beach, which is mad.
Yeah, which seems quite crazy. I wonder to what extent the government's hands are tied with the borders. I think there's an awful lot of legislation which gets passed way above our heads, far beyond the electoral process, which is quite unavoidable. So I believe that most people, if you were to ask them, would say that migrants have to stop at the first safe country and they can't travel beyond that. And to travel beyond that, they cease to be, asylum seekers rather.
Yeah. That
they cease to be asylum seekers, and therefore when they come over here to Britain on the Channel, they're illegal immigrants. And that seems like common sense. However, a large amount of judicial activism at the international level has ensured that actually is not the case legally. So while we see illegal immigrants, the state and the government, which they have to see things according to to see it by the book, see people who are asylum seekers coming across, no matter how mad it appears. So yeah, I think it's an extremely difficult situation. It does look crazy, but I think there are rational explanations for how it's come about. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things is this United Nations Migration Compact, which I think Theresa May signed up to on our behalf just before she left power. And it's like all these things. I mean, unless you do this, for a living, or you've got a very committed and bright mind, sitting down and reading through that document is it's not something I'm really equipped to do. But having read through sort of summary pages of what it does, and it seems to be that it's not legally binding, except that the only country really that is avoiding it, other than the usual suspects that aren't part of the West, if you like, is Australia. So every other Western country is sticking to the United Nations Migration Compact and taking in asylum seekers, even though they've passed through other nations, which just seems, just seems nuts. So they're not asylum seekers, as you say. They're economic migrants. If they're, France is a safe place to live. So, and frankly, so's Italy and Greece and everywhere else. So it can only be, I think, a European trying to spread people out. It can only be that. That's my supposition, that rather than Greece sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, we don't want 6 million people here, they've kind of spread them out over Europe. But
there is other legislation outside of that UN migration pact, and also court action. Because we've got common law, so there are court cases where legal asylum seekers that we would say are illegal immigrants. Okay, I'm not defending this, by the way. I'm just trying to explain it. Where judges have ruled that people, for whatever reason, for example, not being able to speak any other second language except for English, do have reason for being in Britain, having arrived here, as we would see, illegally, from somewhere like France or Italy or Spain or wherever it might be, usually France. So we really are in a bind with that. In my view, if the law puts us in a position where the British public are under threat, then that law should be disregarded, because a government's first duty, a state's first duty, is to protect the citizenry, to protect the borders. But in the modern progressive liberal era, that sort of thing has sort of gone out the window, hasn't it? Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a few years ago now, when we first, I don't know when we first. Well, I suppose a lot of this kicks. It happened before as well, but a lot of it starts after 9/11, and then the American response and everything else. And there was stuff happening. Obviously, there was a response there because of 9/11, and there's obviously been tension between the East and the West for a long time, but for thousands of years. But if I look back now, in Europe, the terror attacks that happened in Europe a few years ago. I was in, where was I? I was in, I forgot where it was. I was in Holland somewhere, in a city in Holland, around Christmas time. And, of course, they've got these great big truck barriers everywhere to stop what's cynically called, trucks of peace sort of rattling through and killing shoppers. So, because they just had that thing in Nice, where a lot of people have been killed with a truck being driven through a market in Nice. And I thought, this is just, why are we setting up 2-ton concrete blocks throughout the city to stop, a committed lunatic from killing members of the public, when if we just enforced our borders and chose who we allowed in and knew who we had in the country, we could have the border at the outside of the country and everyone would be freer to travel. At the moment, nobody can drive down this high street because you can't trust the person next to you not to be a murderer. I've always thought that to be the most ridiculous situation, where everyone on the left, the progressives, if you like, not always on the left, but the progressives are all anti-borders and pro sort of, this melting pot. And yet at the same time, you end up having borders. Like, you used to be able to walk into the House of Parliament, and now there's all sorts of checkpoints outside the House of Parliament for the same reason, because they had a terror attack and a policeman was killed, and so they've had to up the security. So all we're really doing is internalising our borders. And what really, and this brings us back to this recent murder of Sir David Amess, is if we're not careful, we're going to end up with the very people that are allowing this to happen being the only people that are protected from the consequences. And I think that's my frustration with the discussion this week about talking about protection for MPs, which is why I raised it with you initially.
Yeah, it's deeply frustrating. I wonder if across the Western world, states and parties and governments haven't made a cynical mathematical calculation about the future, which is that it belongs to progressives and Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
That is entirely possible as an explanation, really. So if you ask people under the age of 30, randomly on the street in Britain, anywhere you care to look, what is the biggest issue facing the world right now? They won't say the spread of socialism. They won't say the fall of the United States. They won't say Islam. They won't say restrictions on civil liberties. They won't say the debt mountain. They'll say climate change. Climate change is, that's bound what they say. So, the borders issue, I think that progressives have far more sway in our country and in many other important countries than we do, and that's what it kind of boils down to in some ways. Yeah. So we've got open borders. The consequences of open borders are, citizens being murdered every now and again, either in random stabbing attacks or with trucks of peace or with bombs in pop concerts or whatever it might be. And rather than close the borders, which the progressives want open, we cope with it by putting barriers up around their town squares and libraries and museums, and go look at the state of France, Paris. They've got bomb and bullet-proof glass walls all the way around the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
Rather than deal with the internal problems they've got there with radical Islam or fundamentalists, literal Islam, they, as you said, internalize their borders.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I was listening to Peter Hitchens the other day on the New Culture Forum, talking to Peter Whittle. Which
I listened to that as well.
Very good, wasn't it? I thought. Well, he's always very good, I think. But I if there's one, whenever I'm feeling like I want to pull what's left of my hair out, I always think, well, at least I'm not Peter Hitchens, because he has been warning of everything that's happening for the last 25 or 30 years, and nobody has really ever listened to him. So, not saying he's always right, but he's a lot of the time he has been. But he had that one phrase which I think Peter Whittle kind of he probably just assumed it was on the same page, but he let it go. He didn't actually challenge him on it, and I thought it was interesting. He said something like, the British Revolution was very different to many of the others, in that it happened without anybody really noticing. And they carried on with the discussion, and Peter Whittle didn't say, what do you mean, the British Revolution? Probably because he feels the same, I suspect. But I look back to sort of Blair, and I'm sure that this Long March, this Gramsci thing was happening well before that. But I think Blair did more damage to this country's institutions and in the long term to this country's future than anyone else I can name. I mean, what's your view on Tony Blair?
The devil himself. Tony Blair is a very shrewd operator who was deeply ideological, in my view. I think Peter Hitchens is absolutely right. He's far more knowledgeable, far older, more experienced person than I am. But I think it's obvious when you start looking at the things that Blair and Mandelson and Nether and Alistair Campbell, of course, said. And Alistair Campbell continues to say, it's weird, isn't it, that very strange that he continues to get a platform in the mainstream media, almost as if Iraq didn't happen, almost as if the whole Blair disaster didn't happen. It was a disaster, but we're still feeling the effects now because they put their placemen throughout society, like landmines, like political landmines in important places in society, so that their legacy would be felt long after they'd departed. I mean, the Islam and open borders is down to them. We had controlled immigration prior to the Blair years. It went from being, what was it, about 50,000 a year to 250, 300,000 a year, which is a staggering increase. And it was deliberate. We know it was deliberate because Andrew Nether wrote it was, I think, in The Independent after they come out of power, saying they wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity, not diversity of thought, in diversity of, well, basically what it meant was mass immigration, mainly from the Islamic world. That's why Brexit happened, I think. I supported Brexit myself, but I don't think it would have stood a chance had it not been for mass immigration by Labour, which is amusing for Andrew Nether and Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair today, I'm sure, because they must know. I mean, they're very intelligent people. Yeah. They must know that what they did caused it, or at least enabled it.
Yes,
for sure. Yeah. That gives me a little bit of pleasure to imagine how much stress it must cause Alistair Campbell to realize, damn, if only we'd had controlled immigration, maybe we wouldn't have left the glorious EU.
Well, I mean, there's two things there, isn't there? The first is that their frustration, I think, is vocalized on a regular basis by, I've forgotten his name, the most inappropriately named man, Lord Adonis.
Oh, God.
Who is, I think he's hysterical. I really do, the way that he still moans on about it. I think their frustration is probably vocalized by him. But at the same time, I'm not totally sure that we really have left. I mean, all we've done is jumped. Globalization seems to be really where it's all going anyway. I suspect, looking at it, I don't pretend to be a great political analyst, but it seems pretty clear that they're building large blocks of power. So you've got Europe, you've got North America, you've got China, and Singapore and what have you, and Pacific Rim or whatever. You look at that, and the next jump from that is to go to fully globalized, isn't it? One world government. So if we're out of Europe, but we're still largely controlled by what's happening now with the economy and the fallout from this the reaction to this virus, I wonder whether we're actually that much better off. And I'm glad we're out. But are we really out? That's my concern. Does it make much difference?
We are out, I believe. The legislation's pretty clear on that. However, I think this is another example of what I referred to before when I was discussing why it is that we have open borders, and I was referring to how Islam is treated with kid gloves. I think that governments, including our own, look to the future and think that the future is progressive and Islamic, and that there will be some kind of compromise between those two groups. So we know what the internal contradictions are on that front. We saw them play out in Birmingham a couple of years ago. Yep. We know that the average imam or committed Muslim probably isn't keen on transgender ideology being taught to the kids. Yeah.
Unlike your average Christian pastor or whatever, who would be all for it in most cases.
Apparently so. So I think that with our exit from the EU, there were people like myself, and I suspect maybe you too, who wanted a much more free market, dynamic, competitive Britain post-EU. I never thought we were going to get that. I thought all the talk of Singapore and the Thames and all that stuff was fanciful, because internally in Britain, the population is very left-wing, extremely left-wing. Support for the NHS, one of the most left-wing organizations in history, probably, is widespread, and most young people are progressives and very, very left-wing. So I just think the government is blowing with the wind on that front. And that's why we haven't been able to take advantage of our exit from the EU. And it feels like we're in it because we're adopting all the same sclerotic, anti-business, anti-free market policies that were hobnailing us while we're in it,
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, it's interesting what you said about whether they've picked a side effectively, and they've decided, the establishment, if you like, the establishment have decided that in the long term, do they pick Islam and the progressive left as the way forward? It's an interesting mix because, as you say, they don't share the same core beliefs. If the progressive left have any core beliefs, they certainly don't share them with Islam. But it's not the first time, is it? Because if you look at these memes that pop around, you look at Afghanistan in the 70s, look at Iran in the 80s. These countries were largely westernized. Now, it might have been, certainly in the case of Afghanistan, Iran's a bit different. It might have been that they were they were not naturally Western. The Shah of the king of Afghanistan, or the Shah of Afghanistan, I've forgotten if it's a king or a Shah, but either way, the main man in Afghanistan was a Western implant, wasn't he? Really, I think. From what I know of it, whereas I think Iran, whilst he was supported by America, Iran has always been very different to a large part of the Middle East. They're a different people, aren't they? For a start, I think
they're different. They labour under the other side of the Islamic civil war, don't they? Under the they're Shia rather than Sunni.
Yes, I think that's right, but they seem to be, if you go back to old times, sort of Persian, I think we're called Persians, what have you, they seem to culturally be very different. That might just be down to religion, but certainly if you look to the 70s and the 80s, they were, and also look at Lebanon or Beirut.
Paris of the Middle East.
Exactly. They were very westernized. Now, I'm not into necessarily westernizing the East. They can do what they want to do, but the fact is that they were, and then what happened was there was a largely communist-driven takeover which allied with radical Islam. As I say, I'm not an expert, but that seems to be what happened with the mullahs in Iran. Obviously, Afghanistan is where it is now, and was when Russia was in there as well. So it seems to be a natural sort of, is it just the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Perhaps that's what drives it.
I'm no expert either, but as I understand it, when people say that Afghanistan, Iran, Lebanon, these places were Western, I think it's exaggerated.
Right.
There were pockets, mainly of elites, in these countries that adopted more Western styles of dress and attitudes, but these were still relatively conservative countries compared to fully Westernized ones, and crucially, economically, they were much more centrally planned and controlled. I reject the idea that that socialism and Marxism are Western. I think that these are antithetical to the rise of Western civilization, really. Even though they were born partly in it, I do think they're antithetical. So these societies, when people say that they were Western, I'm not sure about that. But it is true that the Soviet Union backed a lot of so-called liberation organizations in these places. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, and one of the most famous ones, but many others too. So there was that weird marriage between communism and sort of political Islam, which, you said before that there isn't much in common between progressivism and Islam, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's true.
Right.
I think there is much more in common than we'd like to think. Both are against the idea of free speech. Both believe that, and being progressives and your typical committed Muslim, that speech should be regulated by governments to make sure that it doesn't cause offence in inverted commas. They both believe that government should play a very significant part in the economy. Obviously, in Islam, there is no divide between, there's no render unto Caesar what is Caesar's in Islam. That doesn't exist. So, people who come from Islamic countries have no concept of small government whatsoever, none. This is extremely significant to our future, because they've brought those values to this country. And while there are some extremely entrepreneurial Muslims in Britain, a lot of them nevertheless do obey Islamic scripture and believe that the government should have a great deal of involvement in our lives, as do progressives. So there are obvious, clear contradictions, especially around sort of sexual politics and education on that front. But I mean, they can find compromises and live side by side, and no problem, I think, in the future. So think about schooling. You just all the progressives have to do is allow a lot of madrasas to be built, and educate their own kids in the elite schools that they say they don't support, but they really do support, and that's how it will play out. It's conservatives, classical liberals, these kinds of people who increasingly are seen as dinosaurs, and I think that's long-winded way of saying that's what's behind a lot of what we see in front of us.
Well, actually, I mean, I think you make a good point there. Actually, thinking about it, I think that's a very good point. In that, yes, they are both collectives, aren't they? Very much so, and they also are very good at organising. Both the sort of Islamic community is a community, a strong community, and also those on the left are incessant in their, they just never give up, do they? They're constantly organising. They don't let one word slip. They understand the power of language, which those on the right, I think we all sort of tend to just let it go. And it's important that you call people on things, which has become very obvious now in the last few years. But no, that's interesting. I mean, I think as well, I suspect the reality is that what will happen eventually, given what progressives tend to believe in, or not, as the case may be, is that what will happen in the end is that we'll live in an Islamic caliphate, because there is no doubt in my mind that of the two ways of living, the Islamic culture will take over from modern progressive culture, because they're so lost. I don't see that's just going down the toilet, in my view.
That's not actually that obvious, because of birth rates. So the Islamic birth rate, the Muslim birth rate, is quite considerably higher than anyone else's, pretty much. Mm-hmm. But that won't remain the same forever and long into the future. So if you had a progressive state, more progressive than now, where you have a progressive elite that is more dominant than the one that we have now, it may well be that the Muslim birth rate falls, and in turn that it becomes less of a radical problem. There's a strong correlation between the high birth rates in the Islamic community and the kind of radicalism. It's look at Turkey, for instance. The high birth rate in the rural areas has meant that Istanbul has been kind of swallowed up by a more fundamentalist Islam than the Ataturk variety from before, which was much more kind of cosmopolitan and open and liberal.
Yeah,
it's overstated how liberal it was. Of course, it's not like I said before. The idea that Afghanistan was ever a terribly liberal place is a bit fanciful.
Yes, no, I think so. I mean, I think you're right. And also, of course, the thing that is easy to forget is that the 70s and the 80s were only 30 years past the end of the Second World War. So another reason why there may be westernized cultures is because we had controlled that area only 20, 30 years before with troops on the ground. So
yeah, very good point.
Yeah. So it doesn't take long, does it, to change? In 20 years, you can do, as we've seen in this country, you can do a lot to a culture in 20 years.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's also quite frightening, no?
Yeah.
Just how fast, sort of like cultural blitzkrieg. It's scary stuff.
Well, I think as well, what the left have done so well is taking over as you mentioned, with Blair installing people everywhere, from the National Trust, the BBC. I mean, obviously everybody is always going to take the BBC and the newspapers. That's an obvious one. But things like the National Trust thing, so that you're constantly getting. I mean, we're now finding that we're constantly battered with whether it's Black Lives Matter or ripping down statues or looking at our history and, oh well, that's problematic because it's got this family used to own slaves, so and all this sort of stuff. But that's coming from every part of society now, because not only were those people put into those places by people like Blair and the police force as well, and the Met and everything else, but also you've got all of the teachers, well, a large number of the teachers and the lecturers in university constantly turning out every year another load of graduates who have been indoctrinated. So I mean, they've done a bloody great job, really, from their perspective, which is quite depressing. And I don't know how you really turn it around. So if you were Prime Minister tomorrow, Ronan, if we managed to get you into number 10, how best would we get, I mean, I'm dropping this on you, but how best would we start the change?
I would try to make the public. I'd use my platform to make the public aware of the constraints of being in government in this country as quickly as possible, because I think the public doesn't know how powerful the progressives, how powerful the left are here, really, and how it constrains you in power. Yeah. So I would find a way to make people more aware of that, because change can only come after that. Change can only come when there's public support. And you can see that the government is obsessed with opinion polls and all the rest of it, gauging public opinion. And it was like that in the Blair years too. If public opinion can be swayed enough in a certain direction, change can come about. So yeah, I would use my platform to make people aware that you need to care what they say in the Guardian, you need to care what they say in the Times, you need to care what the big wigs at the NHS think. People need to realise that that's how it is. Yeah. And that the National Education Union, if the National Education Union turns around and says we want X, Y, and Z, you can't just say no. And they've got hundreds of thousands of members that teach your kids that will walk out. They will leave your children without an education for weeks on end if they don't get their way. That's the reality.
Yeah. I mean, how is this? I'm always conscious of the dangers of unions, but at the same time, in recent past, I've also been very aware that the one thing that might save us from government overreach in other areas is effectively collectivization, or organizing civil disobedience or whatever. But I, until recently, hadn't really been too worried specifically about unions, because I'm older than you. When I was I can remember I was at school when Margaret Thatcher was in power. I was probably 14 when the Falklands happened, so I remember we were all very worried that we might get called up. It was quite amusing looking back on it. But so I'm older than you, and I can remember that. And Margaret Thatcher did a pretty stellar job at taking the sting out of trade unions. But in the interim, it suddenly seems that unions have now suddenly got their bite back, their sting back.
They're immensely powerful.
Sorry?
They're immensely powerful.
Is that because we are very vulnerable at the moment? With schools in particular, I mean, the teachers' unions seem very powerful. But is that largely because they effectively, if people can't send their kids to school, they can't go to work in many cases because there's two people both working. Is it because we are now in a vulnerable position that they're so powerful, or do you think they've been becoming more powerful for a long time?
And they've been becoming more powerful for a long time since the Thatcher years. There has been this enduring, what amounts to a myth now, belief that the unions had been crushed and that there was no union power left after Thatcher, that there was just nothing but the sort of robber baron employer, the old man moneybags, monopoly man with the big cigar, and that's it. Nonsense, basically. If that's true, then explain to me why the minimum wage kept going up.
Yeah.
Even though that's economically illiterate. Explain to me why that happened if unions had no power. Where we're at right now, I mean, there's a certain amount of advantage taking here of opportunism. I think that's key to everything that's happened over the last 2 years. If you remember at the beginning of the COVID mad era, certainly in our own country, which is sort of February, March 2020, if you remember, if you recall, you will see Laura Kuenssberg, Beth Rigby, Pesto, Lewis Goodall, all the big wigs in the media, waving the doomsday report from Imperial College, demanding restrictions, demanding lockdown.
Yeah,
I watched that unfold before me, and I was like, "Oh my God, we're living in a sort of." I read my notes recently from that time. I'd written that we're living in a mediocrity, which was doesn't really work, but it is what it was like. It was like we were being ruled by the media, by this leftist media. Mm-hmm. What I didn't see was the unions in the background, and the author Ben Irvine brought that to my attention with his essay recently on the subject, which I advise everyone to go and read, to be challenged. Maybe if you've got assumptions about what's going on, I think you should go and read it. It's a very empirical essay on the role of the unions, and I add to it the media. I see it as a media and union driven problem, specifically a leftist media, which is most media. They've been central. They're incredibly powerful, despite received wisdom that they're not. Yeah, that's unavoidable. I think. Have you seen the last few days, Sam? The apparently coordinated attack on our freedoms by the media, the BMA, Unison, Unite, USDOR.
The BMA. I don't really. I don't watch TV, so I everything that I get comes from secondhand, if you like. So from other media, but I have been very aware of the BMA. I do listen to talk radio, and I watch the odd clip of GB News, but I don't watch BBC. It drives me nuts, so I just can't watch it. And I'm very aware of the BMA and other people's comments on the BMA, which I find that's hit me. That's hit me from outfield. Really has. I've always thought of the BMA as being a bunch of GPs basically, but no, they seem very.
It's an extremely powerful union that represents. It doesn't represent all doctors. There is another far smaller union, but it represents the vast majority of them. And that's all doctors, whether they be surgeons or GPs or epidemiologists or wherever. They are very radical. So to give some indication of the kind of people that are running it, they've been running a campaign on the BMA website since last year for members to send money to the United States to bail out funds for rioters, BLM rioters who've been arrested by the police.
Right.
That's
I mean, not far away
really
from
crazy stuff.
Bolsheviks, basically. It was like,
exactly.
So that, I mean, this is the other thing that's so global. I mean, I noticed the other day that I think the Secretary of State in the USA, involved with the environment. I don't know their full title, but basically the person in charge of national parks and general, I mean, they've obviously got a lot of national parks and things in America, and the Secretary of State that's been proposed to take over for Biden on that, has previously been found guilty and has been convicted of being a terrorist. She I don't know whether she went to prison or not, but only because she worked with the FBI. But she wrote a letter on behalf of this domestic terror organisation, who at the time, this is probably 20, 30 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, were putting 10-inch steel spikes into trees. The idea being that you put these spikes in all the trees, and then when they're harvested, these spikes basically screw up the chainsaws and kill people. And there's been a horrendous number of people, like 30, 40, 50 people killed and many more injured over the last 3 decades. She is now likely to become a member of the United States government. So that's the kind of radical nature of the people that have got power now in America.
Yeah.
And
across the West.
And I think, well, it sounds like it. Yeah. I mean, that's new to me. I knew, as I say, I'm no fan of unions generally, and I am very aware of, because it's basically Ben. It has been his hobby horse, hasn't it? Since the beginning, he has been shouting into the ether about this,
the thing is that he's right.
Well, he may well be. I don't know. And I wasn't necessarily saying that he wasn't right. I didn't really know, and it wouldn't surprise me. I think I never really engaged with him, but I know he's had a lot of toing and froing with various other people on this issue. He's written it's a recent essay that he's written, or is it an older essay that he's?
I think it's about a month old, and I'll tell you, I think it's on Squire magazine's website,
right,
and on pinned to his profile on Twitter. Look, it does not state that, does not show that there is no involvement further up, that there is no dodgy money going into pharmaceutical companies, for example. It doesn't negate any of that stuff. It's not about that. It is about the role on the ground in this country and the political reality that governments face when dealing with unions. And they are extremely powerful, and they're supported by the leftist media, which is most of the media.
Yeah.
And there's a very clear timeline. You can see the government in January 2021 turning around and saying that schools are safe, kids can go back. At the very same time, in response to that, just afterwards, I should say, Kevin Courtney, head of the General Secretary of the National Education Union, called an online meeting, a Zoom meeting. Zoom's been central to union power growing, by the way. There's a really good piece in the Irish Times about this, which again I highly recommend people read. Right. I'll post it on my Samizdat Mag Twitter, or alternatively, if you Google Irish Times Union Power Zoom, that should probably bring it up. They called this meeting 400,000 members. Think about it. In normal times, you're not going to get 400,000 people together, are you?
No.
We haven't got a stadium big enough to do that. But Zoom means that they can do it. Kevin Courtney reached, if not all of those people, a lot of them, and they all unanimously agreed that they wouldn't go to work. And the following day, the government called another lockdown, because what choice did it have? Look, I say these things, and I know that people listening, I know will say, well, Bill Gates told them to. Bill Gates told them to. And personally, I don't find that to be an evidence-based argument. If someone can give me, he was here last week, wasn't he? He put how much in? £400 million into the Green Kitty. You know, our government sneezes that at lunchtime. You know,
I don't. I mean, I know where you're coming from. I don't. To just put where I think I stand on this, and I mean, at the end of the day, who really knows? But where I turned off a little bit to Ben's, because he's been very consistent on this from the very beginning. It wasn't that I didn't disagree with what he was saying. It was that I thought there could be two different things. Because he seemed to be, and I may have just been not listening to him properly, he seemed to be discounting the idea that, well, I know I've seen he'd said, you know, forget about the World Economic Forum, forget about this, that, and the other. It's the unions that this is where the problem is. And I thought that was a little bit binary. I don't think it has to be binary. I think they could both be two sort of sides of the same coin almost.
Well, this is the message that I've been putting to friends and to those who read my Twitter account. You can believe that Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, and Blair are involved in a big social experiment, a big social engineering project. You can believe that, but also recognize, because it's empirically true, that the unions are, and the leftist media that work with the unions are a central part of what's going on before us. So you can say after that, you can conclude, you know, what can I do? What can I do about Klaus Schwab? Nothing. Anyone who thinks they can do anything about Klaus Schwab is in cloud cuckoo land. However, there are Unison, National Education Union, USDOR, Unite, and so forth, offices in large towns and cities up and down the country. There are, union general secretaries up and down this country who you can, go after. When I say go after, I mean physically. I mean, you can write about them, you can expose them, you can show that they have connections to all kinds of radical and dangerous organizations, from the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Hamas through to, in the past with the older ones, the Soviet Union, Antifa, all these kinds of things. The Communist Party of Great Britain, Socialist Worker Party. You can expose this for the public, and we know it. We know the public is aware of of these organizations and knows that they're not good. You can actually do something and make a difference. Maybe it won't work in the long run. Maybe it's not enough, but it will. If you believe there is a global conspiracy, going after the unions and going after the leftist media that are trumpeting their positions, disrupts it. It does disrupt it. It gives you something concrete to work with.
That's a fair comment. I mean, I think the problem, I look at this from, I look at the fourth industrial revolution and the this Build Back Better thing, which is repeated by every government all over the world. And I cannot believe that it isn't an orchestrated medium to long-term plan that's being implemented. However, if you look at, and what I don't understand, so first of all, I've looked into that in some amount of detail, and so much is happening orchestrated a lot, throughout the world, sort of within a week. So it happens in New Zealand, then it happens in Australia, then it happens here, and everyone's using the same phraseology, everyone's talking about the same things. The vaccine passports being a case in point, everyone's desperate to bring those in, or nearly everybody. So I think I can't be convinced that that's not something that's planned and is happening.
Well, hang on, Sam. Hang on. It's important, because by that logic, you must then recognise that the NHS Federation, the Royal College of Medicine, the Shadow Health Secretary in most of the Labour Party, Sky, BBC, Talk Radio, LBC, Times, Guardian, Observer, Mirror, all the broadcasters, Channel 4, Channel 5, and all the unions, all the major unions in this country, BMA, National Education Union, USDOR, Unite, Unison, the nursing union, all of them in the last 3 or 4 days have come out with exactly the same line on mask mandates and social distancing and enacting Plan B immediately, and all this, as if they're in lockstep. Yes. Same thing, and so when people say, well, look, the Build Back Better messaging, the Great Reset messaging, all the rest of it is coordinated around the world. Well, this is, by the same logic, this is coordinated.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'm saying is I don't think the one has to be necessarily, it doesn't have to be binary. I think perhaps they can both be, and to some extent, of course, they probably share a lot of the same. I mean, I do think the Build Back Better, this I hate this phrase, levelling up and stakeholder capitalism, both of which
these are socialism.
Yeah, it is. It's basically socialism. It's I mean, levelling up. Well, levelling up is equity. To me, that says equity, not equality. Equity. This is the other problem. People are so ignorant of the phraseology. But for anyone who's listening to this that doesn't still understand this, equity and equality are not the same thing. Equality is effectively equality of opportunity. The opportunity, in my mind, would be everyone gets the opportunity to go to a grammar school if they can benefit from it because they're intelligent enough to benefit from it. Whereas equity means we haven't got enough black head teachers, so we're going to bring them in. Would you say that's a reasonable definition that I'm using there, or do you think I'm being too simplistic?
So the week before the US election, Kamala Harris turned around and said that equity is a quality of outcome.
Yes.
Which, so equity has two meanings. One is there's a financial meaning, which is separate, and the other is it's a political word, what Mao used to call magic words. Equity in this sense means equality of outcome. So they will say that equality is, because they know equality has positive connotations in people's minds. So they'll say that equality is equity and equity is equality. But it basically means state control of the means of production in order to bring about equal outcomes for most people, except for the Politburo who will live in splendor.
Yeah. So your average, I mean, I went to Cuba back in 2000, and all of the people behind the bars serving mojitos all spoke perfect English, were all very personable and pleasant people, and the vast majority of them were surgeons because they could earn more or on tips serving Westerners in bars than they could being a surgeon. So that's what communism.
You get surgeon taxi drivers in Cuba and all the rest, which is tragic.
It is.
Let's call it what it is. It's tragic. It's disgusting anti-human ideology.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, I think this is the problem as well. I think I'm now in my 50s, and so I am old enough to remember, even though obviously coming from the West. I mean, I was one of the last people in East Berlin. Literally within a couple of hours, I went through Checkpoint Charlie. So and I didn't even know what was happening when it all started. So I was completely...
Can you recount that story? I don't know if you've told this in your podcast before. I might not want to, but I would like to hear that.
Yeah, well, I will briefly. I have told it before, but it was I was with an English girl who I had just started seeing, and she was in the British Army, a teacher in the British Army. And I went out to visit her, and they were based in Minden. And we decided to go to, this was in 89, and we decided, it was 89, wasn't it? Yeah, so we decided to go to Berlin for the week, to West Berlin. So we drove to West Berlin from Minden in a car with 3 other teachers who were also in the forces, and we came through on a road visa. So you drive down You drive down a motorway which is in East Germany. You're not allowed to stop or leave the road, and you have a little Union Jack flag on a bit of paper, and if you get stopped for speeding, you put this flag up and they wave you through. So basically, we drove through East Germany, went through the various checkpoints. I saluted I was in my early 20s. I saluted a young Russian soldier on the border, and then we get into West Berlin, and this is relevant to it because I basically ended up having a big row with this girl. So we were now stuck in West Berlin, staying in the same hotel, but didn't want to see each other. So it was like, right, this could be awkward. So I spent a lot of time on my own, wandering around doing tourist stuff. And on the last day that we were there, due to go back early in the morning, I thought, well, I haven't been over to East Berlin yet, so I'll go. You can go over. You can, as a Westerner, you can just go as a tourist. So I queued up. I went on the tube to the U-Bahn or whatever to Checkpoint Charlie, and I went through Checkpoint Charlie, and they checked my passport, let me in, and I spent the afternoon just wandering around East Berlin, and I wouldn't have told anything was really happening. It was just a normal sort of day. East Berlin, just actually as an aside, I've got some photographs still of this, and they're black and white, which makes it even moodier. East Berlin and West Berlin was so different. First of all, West Berlin had got Porsches and Volkswagens and BMWs all over the road, and East Berlin had got Trabants everywhere, which are these little, I think they're two-stroke cars, which nobody could afford to run in town because they didn't have enough fuel. So they were in traffic jams, all pushing their cars because they're quite light. So there was hardly any noise because everyone is just at the traffic lights with their car, and then they'd shuffle forward 3 or 4 cars and they would just push their cars forward, which was weird to watch. And then the other thing is that everything was grey. There's absolutely no advertising anywhere. So it took me ages to work it out. I couldn't work out what was different. And then I realised that there were 2 things. First of all the buildings are just grey, nothing on them, because there's no advertising. And secondly, most of the shops had got very little in them. They'd got some stuff in the windows, but there was not much in the shops. And there were queues for the shops. So it was like, it's exactly what you're told about communism. But I got a sort of a short 3 or 4 hour first-hand view of it, and then I had a little panic because I'm wandering around. There's a lot of bomb sites still in East Berlin because I think as part of the punishment, because of course the Russian-German war was far more bitter, if you like, than the American-German war, and because I think there's a racial element to it, and that obviously there was lots of raping and pillaging that went on both sides. So as I understand it, the Russians purposefully didn't rebuild large parts of East Germany. So there were still bomb sites everywhere. And I think that's why. And of course, the wall was there with the guard dogs and the viewing towers and the minefields. And I went past a grave, which was, I went on a train somewhere, and there was a cemetery on the side of the railway track. And I don't know how I knew this. Somebody must have told me. There was a new grave there, and apparently 2 people had been killed the week before trying to cross the river, and they'd been shot. So it was all very real. It was very Harry Lime or whatever, you know. And then I had a little panic because I was all on my own wandering around, and I thought, well, I'd better get back. It's starting to get dark. I think it must have been like 4 in the afternoon or 5 in the afternoon. I can't remember. And I thought, well, I'd better get back. And I got back to Checkpoint Charlie, and they sorted out all the Westerners from all the non-Westerners, because there is a transit of people that goes into West Germany, people that are allowed to. And they sorted us all out. They sorted the Westerners out largely by our clothing. So, and I'm not a particularly well-dressed person at all, but compared to the people that were wearing these, you know, everything seemed grey, I was probably very obviously a Westerner. They sorted us out and lined us up against a wall. and never much fun being lined up against a wall
No.
in a communist state. So I was significantly paranoid. And then at this point, I realised I'd come from Minden, from a British forces military base in Minden, through East Germany to West Berlin on a visa which was a British forces visa. And I suddenly thought, I'm in civilian clothes. I'm not sure, because I seem to remember somebody saying you can go to East Berlin, but you have to wear your uniform. And at the time, I thought, I didn't think anything of it, because of course I hadn't got a uniform. And then I thought, oh shit, am I about to get arrested for being a spy? Because I was in civilian clothes. Anyway.
And were you military?
No, my girlfriend was military. That was it. So, and she was a teacher. So, but I was on a military visa. I'd travelled with a vehicle full of people from the British Army. So I suddenly thought I could be in a bit of trouble here. Anyway, that's as bad as it got. I basically got lined up with these other people. Then one by one, we walked through Checkpoint Charlie, which is basically a long building. You've seen it on the TV, but
I've been there, but it's interesting.
Right. So you know, yeah. So you know. Now. So there's like a corridor. I don't know if you went through it, but there's a long corridor, and you walk in one end on the East German side, and then they close a door, and then you walk into like a hospital ward, if you like, but it's just a big wide corridor. And then you walk through the corridor to the other end, and then they open the door, and you walk like you go into a prison or something. They open that, you walk in, they close that, and then you stick your passport with your visa through this window, and a uniformed cuff comes out, and you don't make any eye contact, right? And they grab it, and they disappear for a while, and you can hear this sort of discussion, and then thankfully it came back out again, and I took the passport and they opened the door and I walked out, and I thought, bloody hell. I mean, it was. I mean, I was obviously, a lot of this was in my mind. I was clearly not in the problem I thought I was. But so that all happened. Still nothing, absolutely no clue anything was happening. I went to bed about 9ish because we got an early start in the morning. And then we set off in the car at I don't know, 5 o'clock in the morning or something to get back to Minden. And when we got back to Minden, all hell had let loose. And there's about 10,000 troops there. And there's an armoured division, or I don't know whether there's a division, but there's a lot of armoured, a lot of tanks there and stuff. And the people were running around, staying at the officers' quarters, and all the officers were running around packing their rucksacks, and there was vans and trucks and tanks and stuff going everywhere. And they were off on manoeuvres, which was basically them reacting to what was happening, which was that the wall was coming down, which at the time I didn't know, but watched on TV in Germany. So it all happened. I can't remember the exact timings, but it was. I remember the entire base disappearing off on these manoeuvres, and they were all very aware that this was more than just manoeuvres. And I remember one of them telling me that they thought they'd be able to hold back a Russian ground attack for about something like 24 hours. So they weren't very. They were all my age, They weren't very optimistic. But anyway, as it turned out, of course, it was the other way around. It was effectively the end of Glasnost. So yeah, it was all a very interesting time. But it seems like another world now. But it all seemed to happen. I probably wasn't that connected at the time. Perhaps it had all been due to happen for a while. But it all seemed a big surprise to me.
Do you think that when we talk about the end of the Cold War, that we're a little bit wrong-headed in ignoring that while the main products of Marxism fell to the ground, the ideology itself never ended, and that really that was the most important component?
Absolutely. I mean, which is very obvious now, isn't it? But I mean, I think there's a large element. I can remember at the time there was a big element of hubris, especially from America at that time that, you know, we've won the Cold War, and there was several years where Russia specifically was, or the USSR, and then Russia really, I think, had their noses rubbed in it to some extent, and also were left to become the Wild West, and obviously that's when Putin and all the rest of it all sort of all these sort of quasi gangsters sort of took over the oil industry and everything else. So yeah, and of course China never changed. I think everyone assumed that China was going to grow a middle class and then suddenly become unable to control their middle class, whereas they've very successfully, it seems, managed to grow their economy and influence and their military power, whilst at the same time retaining control from the outside. Anyway,
it's immense complacency, China, isn't it? I mean, the Western approach to it, this idea that, as you say, that a middle class would grow and China would then sort of moderate and liberalize. It's just not worked out that way, and it, you know, it's easy to do the retrospective counterfactual, but was it ever in any way obvious that it would go that way? I don't know.
I don't know. I think it was probably wishful thinking, wasn't it? I mean, the problem is that these geopolitical things, there are people that know a lot more. I mean, you look at someone like John Pilger, who obviously is I would call a bit of a lefty anyway, but seems to be a very capable and well-informed journalist, and he has been saying for, I would say, at least a decade, probably longer, that the big risk is going to be a war with China. Although he feels that, I think that China's being pushed into it. I think that seems to be his view. I may be misquoting him.
John Pilger, in my experience, will always, you know, he may be well informed of that, I agree, but he will always conclude that we're doing the pushing, or we're in the wrong, or whatever it is. You know,
I think you're right. He's always been, I mean, certainly from Vietnam on or whatever. It's that's my experience of him. But either way, whatever the problem, we've now got two superpowers, and it's very clear that China is in the ascendancy and America is in big trouble. I think the USA, without going into too much detail on the USA, I mean, where they are now with I would be surprised. My view, and it doesn't matter if I use a little bit of hyperbole here, because I'm just me with a podcast. It's not like I'm broadcasting to the nation. But I think there was a coup when the last election happened. I think the election was stolen. Whether that stays it if it goes on YouTube, I don't know. But I just think if you look at whatever you think of Trump, I cannot believe that Joe Biden is the most popular president, was elected with more votes than Obama, and is supposedly the most popular president in terms of vote count ever. You only have to look at Trump's when he was out on the stump, and look at the stadiums he'd got full of people, and then look at Biden in a car park talking to literally a dozen people, and think, I don't know. I cannot believe that they haven't already had a coup. The fact that they were putting as soon as they got into power, before Trump was even out the door, there was this changeover, isn't there? But as soon as they had the keys to the White House, they were putting troops around the White House and around Capitol buildings. They got all because apparently a bunch of people in red MAGA hats were going to come and rip the place down. I mean, have you seen the recent footage? I watched it live when it happened, but have you seen the recent footage of this storming of the Capitol building?
Well, you mean the insurrection? where that police officer was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher.
Oh God!
All this stuff. It's sinister.
Very sinister.
We can laugh about it, but it's not, on some important level, it's not funny at all. It's sinister stuff. It's been used to justify persecuting Trump voters in general, having them sort of designated as domestic terrorists and
Yeah.
equated to the kind of people that we were discussing earlier in this conversation, who, like the man that stabbed David Amos to death,
Yeah.
or any other Islamic terrorist you care to imagine. It's sinister stuff. It doesn't hold water in any way when you go and look at the videos and listen to the testimony. And it was weird, wasn't it? They in the wake of that election, they were very quick, as you point out, to sort of bombard themselves in safely away from the population. But you would think if they were so popular that they got, was it 80 million votes? Yeah, they wouldn't be very, very worried about things like that.
Well, exactly, and the fact that they've closed down reporters, they've closed down all reporting on it, but the idea that every legal challenge sort of faded away, and when it went to Supreme Court, even members of the Supreme Court who you might have imagined, and I mean, I'm not American, but I don't want a partisan judicial system, but you would expect, with the evidence that was put in front of them, some of which I've seen, they would at least have heard it, but they wouldn't even hear it. The arguments for Arizona and all these other places. No, it seems total madness. And as you say, the idea now, looking at the videos, that even the guy who turns out as an actor, the guy with the
headdress
on his head, yeah. I mean, I've seen video recently. I saw it at the time when it was happening, but I've seen video recently of him wandering into the main chamber. And there's a policeman there, and they're chatting, and he goes in and he sits down at the speaker's chair, and he's obviously just sort of LARPing, really. He's just sort of there's no raised voices, and they just sit there and chat. And then one guy's been hit in the head with a dum-dum bullet or something, so he's bleeding. That's it. And then I saw the Ashley Babbitt, unlawful killing, I would call it, but who knows. I don't know if you saw that, but I saw that live, and she was coming up the stairs. This was a bit more rowdy. I mean, this was out of the ordinary. There was probably 2 or 3 dozen people running.
It was no more rowdy than the storming of the Capitol by leftists over Brett Kavanaugh.
Oh, no, it was probably less than that. But they ran up the stairs, they were following a policeman as well, which was weird. So there was like a security guard come policeman who was waiting for them at every landing. And then as they came up the next landing, he would run ahead. And I thought, what the hell is this about? And then they got there. And then, for those people who haven't seen it, they got to this locked door, which was the locked door into the chamber itself, and or a corridor leading to the chamber itself. And there was a security guard on the other side, and a small window in the door was smashed, and the person who now turns out was Ashley Babbitt, this female protester, put her foot on the window to look like she wanted to jump in, and without any warning, this security guard, just at point-blank range, shot her in the head and killed her. And as that happened and she fell back on the ground, half a dozen SWAT members were standing behind her. In fact, they were looking for the shooter. So I don't know if you've seen this, but it's stunning. You can almost see by their body language, they're kind of going, "What the hell?" It's I may be reading too much into it, but at the time watching it live, they seemed as shocked as everybody else that she'd been shot. And then, of course, his identity, the shooter's identity, is only recently come to light.
Which is in stark contrast to the identities of police officers white police officers involved in shooting black people.
Yeah.
Be it St. George of Floyd or various other figures, which was strange, wasn't it? There was no focus whatsoever on him. He was, sort of ignored in the narrative from the media, which usually is obsessed with the identity of the shooter.
Yeah, and blaming the police or the Secret Service.
Yeah, using it for political gain. This was different. We'll explain why it was different. I mean, she was unarmed.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that she should have been doing what she was doing. That's
No, absolutely. I mean, it
not the point, though, is it really?
no. I mean, the point is that had she been challenged and had a gun pointed at her, you know, had she then still jumped in, well, then you could go, well, that's escalated. But it was still only one person. At some point, I understand that you might think that, you know, significant force or lethal force has to be used, but that was definitely not it. And the fact that it wasn't investigated and he's not in front of a court is just outrageous. It's,
yeah. Compared to Derek Chauvin's fate,
yeah,
you know, which looked a lot like a show trial.
Oh God. Well, I mean, like you, I'm sure you've watched it. And when I first you watched the footage, and he's just kneeling there, looking sort of blankly at everyone. You think, what the hell are you doing? I mean, it's outrageous, isn't it? It looks absolutely outrageous. And when it's still not great, but when you then learn that it's a recognised form of restraint and that they are trained to use, and that you see the video footage that shows that he wanted to be laid on the floor.
And that he was stood there saying, "I can't breathe."
Yes, and he was saying that when he was in the other squad car, like 20 minutes before, he was complaining that he was obviously high, wasn't he? I mean, I'm not saying that it shouldn't have gone to court, and it may well be that some sort of unlawful killing or, you know, whatever might have been.
Murder is
no.
If you were to take all of the political components out of it and try to look at it objectively in the common law tradition, you would not have said that man was guilty of murder. You could argue that he was guilty of some kind of negligence or I don't know, but murder, no. That was a predetermined
he
conviction.
hadn't got a chance. I mean, the fact that the jury were getting bussed through crowds every day, baying for his sort of incarceration, and
can I just give a shout out for something there that I think you and readers will get something out of. Have a look up online, the Sunflower murder case in South Africa. Google that and the name Rian Malan, Rian Malan. He's one of my favorite journalists and one of the best writers in the world, one of the best non-fiction writers in the world. Have a look at this case in South Africa from about 3 years ago, and I think that it speaks to what happened with Derek Chauvin, and I think it speaks a little bit to our future in the West, including in Britain, and how where race is a component in crimes like what we saw, the outcome will not be good for white people in the court system.
Well, that, as a white person, is incredibly depressing, but I don't disagree with you. I will look into that. I mean, it seems clear that, you know, more and more well, even just silly little things like the when they arrested the murderer of Sir David Amis, the police tweeted out "arrest made," and I don't know if you noticed this, but it was
25-year-old man.
25-year-old man, but also that the image that they used, and I appreciate this is a stock image, I presume, was a white man in handcuffs. Now,
oh wow. God, I didn't see that.
Yeah. And I presume it's a stock image, but every other stock image you can bet in that police media's library would not have been of a white person. So why is the one, you know, because, I mean, come on. I mean, I do a little bit of web design from time to time to fill I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. And I've got a friend that I designed a website for, and she's a fairly normal, average, non-political person. And she said, I need some photographs of people on this, that, and the other. And I said, well, I found a photograph. It was perfect. It was a perfect illustration of what she wanted. And I sent it to her. And I even thought at the time, I know what she's going to say when I send her this. And not because of her politics, just because of the current climate. And she phoned me up. She said, that's great. That's brilliant, that photo. But I said, they're all white people, aren't they? And she went, yeah, can't we just have a couple of brown people as well? And I said, well, of course we can, but isn't that ridiculous? And she said, yeah, I know it is. I know it's stupid, but, these days. And I'm afraid that's the way it is. It's just, it's exasperating that everything has to be seen through the lens of skin colour.
It's disgusting.
It is.
I think people need to get a bit more angry about this stuff and how divisive and destructive it has been for our society. Identity politics is a fucking cancer. Excuse me. I don't know if I can swear.
No, you can.
It is cultural and societal cancer, and it needs to be treated as such. It's appalling.
Yeah.
I mean, when I grew up, I'm a bit younger than you, but I'm still been around a little while. I'm almost 38. Where I grew up, we just a nipper. Fortunately, a bald one. We had brown and black and white and yellow and whatever. I don't know what the terms are we're supposed to use. I refuse to obey by any of the diktats. We had people of all different races and nationalities in my school, but overall, most people were white, 80-90%. Because that is the country we live in. Mm-hmm. We lived in then too, and it didn't matter to us. We didn't care. Interestingly, where it mattered was the one or two Islamic kids in the school, and they were much more aloof. They were noticeably aloof, has to be said.
Right.
Looking back in retrospect, they were noticeably aloof.
Well, I've heard other
that. We some close friends of mine were black, others were white, but we didn't talk about that. It didn't matter. We didn't give a shit. We played football, we skateboarded, we exchanged CDs, recording them for each other when we didn't have the money to buy the albums we wanted. We exchanged books. We exchanged magazines and hung out together, doing things we shouldn't do. Whatever, we were kids. We were normal. Now, I mean, my brother's a teacher, and I had dinner with him and his girlfriend last Friday night, and he was telling me that now the 14 and 15-year-olds are racialized. They're racialized. That's absolutely awful. It's tragic.
It is. Well, tragic is the word, because, as you say, I mean, certainly when I left school, I go to college. I left school at 80, did my A-levels in 82, 83. So,
year of my birth.
Right. that's very depressing. And then things, there was political correctness was already in play, but it was very limited. And there was, I'm sure there still is, racism around, and it was probably more blatant in certain areas than others then. But I mean, there's always going to be racism. It's between different groups, even if it's not serious. It's going to be, there's going to be some. But yeah, it wasn't a big thing, and I suppose people could say, oh well, that's because you're in the majority. Well, yeah, because I was in the majority because the majority of people in this country, when I was born in the mid-60s, the majority were white. Although, interestingly, it wasn't, as you say, it wasn't even... I suppose, I'm just trying to think if there was ever... I went to a private school, and there was... so I had Chinese, or I don't know if they'd been Chinese, actually, probably Taiwanese, or... Nigerian, quite a few Nigerian kids, some Indian kids, some English Indian kids, if that's the right way of saying it. There was people from all over the world. And apart from weird things like we were all very amused that the Nigerian kid used to, this is when we were like 16, 17, used to shave his skin, his face with a cream, which was very weird to us. He used to use like an imac on his face. And I don't know whether that was just him or whether that was because his beard was different to ours, but that was the sort of thing that amused us. It wasn't in any way, it was just an other. It wasn't in any way a sort of
A malice.
nasty or a malice or a oh, we're better than you or anything like that. I mean, in fact, he was, I think at the time, was the son of the foreign minister of Nigeria or something. So he was far more of an elite than I would ever be. Anyway, no, it's really, really worrying because we've kind of followed, with American culture, we've inherited American problems, haven't we? I think I'm right in saying that slavery in this country, I think, slavery in the UK was never legal. Now, I may be wrong there, but I heard that somewhere, and from a relatively authoritative source. You had slave owners and slave traders in this country, and there were slaves in this country who were brought here by other people. But my understanding is that slavery itself was never legal. Are you doing a Google search?
I'm checking that out. I don't know the answer to that question. It's caught me.
I'm not sure.
That's very interesting.
But it surprised me when I heard it. But I heard it from it was a historian. I'm trying to think who it was. It was a fairly credible historian. But either way, we know the background. We know that slavery was. The British Empire had a large say in abolishing slavery worldwide. And even if we didn't, and we were the worst thing since sliced bread, what on earth has that got to do with? We've been through that. We've come out the other side. Why are we reintroducing it now? It's just politically useful to certain parties. I think that's the reality.
I'm going to put it out to Twitter.
Oh, okay. Let's
see what comes back.
Well, of course, lots of people will know the answer, but then they're not necessarily right. I shall have to look at it, and I might put a note in the end of this podcast. But it's certainly something there's lots of things. There's a chap on YouTube who probably won't be there for very much longer, called his channel's called History Debunked. Have you come across him at all?
I haven't. No. Should I?
He's an interesting guy. He's probably in his 70s. Seems very well travelled and seems to know an awful lot about history. I don't know what his background is. He is old enough not to worry about dressing up what he says. So, and he's... So
it's a wonderful thing. I envy that of people like far older than me. More older than me, but I mean far older. We listen to people like Thomas Sowell speak, and they can see, you can see that they know they don't have to play by these rules, and that it doesn't really matter to them because in 10 or 20 years they're highly unlikely to be around.
Yeah. I mean, Thomas Sowell is he's an absolute hero of mine. I think he's just bloody brilliant. Yes. Anyway, well, no,
I have to say that this might not go down too well with a lot of people, but I'll probably be more bothered when Thomas Sowell dies than when the Queen dies.
Yeah,
personally, because I'm not a Republican. I'm not a monarchist. I'm pragmatic on that stuff. I think that overall, monarchy has a better track record, historically more stable track record than republicanism does. But I don't have any kind of emotional skin in the game, probably because my family spans Ireland and Britain, and I've lived in both places, and that I look to the United States for a lot of my philosophical guidance, I suppose.
Well, I think most people, if they're not Republicans, and even if they are Republicans, actually probably have some respect, even if it's grudging, of the Queen. And I think she really hasn't put a foot wrong in terms of what her role is as a head of state. I don't think there's much you could say she's done wrong. Although more recently, I'm certainly not a monarchist anymore. I think it's the only reason I wouldn't want a republic now is because Tony Blair is still alive.
Because he'd be instrumental.
If he was, well, because he would, the first thing he'd want to be is be president, isn't it? If we could get rid of the monarchy and not have anything replace it, I'd be quite happy to lose the monarchy now.
So like a sort of anarchic sort of situation.
Yeah, well, I am kind of. I think I'm becoming a bit of an aspiring sort of anarchist anyway, to be honest. But that's for another time. But no, I think, I mean, the Queen, and obviously she's not very well at the moment, so who knows? And she's 95 or whatever. I think most people feel that she's done a pretty good job, and she's certainly given of herself for the nation. But then my brother reminded me the other day that she officially, so I only take his word on this, but apparently when we went into the European Union in the 70s, she effectively became a citizen of the EU. So largely, from a legal perspective, she kind of abdicated her role, which no one has ever talked about or said that that's the case and would ever admit to, but makes some sense if we were going to be held to account within the EU's legal framework. And I think what's happening now, more specifically, the fact that she's been quiet on what's happening now, her strength has been that she's not been participating politically in front of everybody. And that's good if you want a head of state who's not politicised, of course. But I think the fact that she's kept quiet on what's happened over the last 2 years completely is, and the fact that she's now making noises, however unofficial, about the green agenda, has swung it for me. I think once she goes, I've got no interest in Charles being king at all. But
I'm with you on that. Until recently, she was my favourite social democrat, pretty much.
Right.
Maybe Peter Hitchens was. That's not as well known as it should be. But the royal family apparently are pretty much social democrats.
Right.
They were very unhappy with Margaret Thatcher's policies, thought they were cruel, and made some noise about it. Andrew Neil, back when he was a journalist, wrote about this in his book, Full Disclosure, which is actually quite good and worth a read, about his time as editor of the Sunday Times and his interactions with Rupert Murdoch and with the royal family.
Right, interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, who knows? I've got absolutely no knowledge of all the stuff that's said and done and everything else, but I just, I'm very much against this whole green agenda. I think it's totally and utterly, well, I think the technical term is bollocks. But I mean, I'm all for having a cleaner planet. I'm all for being efficient in using resources. But I mean, when I was at school in the 70s again, we were all being frightened then by an imminent ice age. That was what sticks in my mind about when I was at school, that we were all told by everybody that there was an ice age coming. And of course, and that's in my lifetime. So if we're talking about an Earth, which is, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of years old, how we can make any judgment about what's happening to the climate and who's responsible for it, I just do not know. But it's such a big it's such a huge thing that there's no way of disproving it either way, is there really? I mean, we all know that scientists can be bought either way, and there's, if you've got 3,000 scientists, you're going to have 3,000 opinions, and they're going to come down in two tribes, depending on who's paying whom. That would be my cynical view, anyway. What's your view on the green agenda?
I think it is corrupt, and obviously so. That it's again another maths model constructed catastrophe, and that it is driven by people who want further centralization of resources and power around the world, and that's obviously what it is. I do not have climate anxiety. Did you see that? I look, when you've got people like the SNP and others using children to push an agenda, openly using children, getting children on camera, saying how they're suffering from climate anxiety and that they are so desperately worried about the future and that governments must act. Of course, by that they don't mean that governments must deregulate the economies in order to make them more dynamic to deal with the problem. What they mean by governments must act is that we must have more government power. When you see that kind of thing going on, Stalin-like brainwashing of children and using them cynically, you're dealing with a sinister movement. I don't think there's any great truth to the claims they make. We're all going to die in 12 years. And I mean, I'm not a scientist, and I know that people will go, "Wow, you're not a scientist. What do you know?" I'm not, but I do know people. I've been around with a lot of people over the years, and I know quite a lot about politics and historical revolutionary movements and things like that, which I've spent a long time reading about. And the green agenda reeks of a power grab for sure.
Yeah, sort of problem, reaction, solution kind of thing. It's in my lifetime, I can remember there's been 2 or 3 big ultimatums that if we don't do anything now, entire nations will be underwater within 12 years. Somebody was, I think, Abby, who's the lady that's on GB News, the comedian.
She's the thing with Calvin Robinson.
Robinson. I don't generally watch it, but I do follow her on Twitter.
Neither do I. Yeah, but I know who you mean. Yeah,
she shared. I think it looked like it was Financial Times, but she shared a clipping that had obviously done the rounds, and it was Prince Charles in 1980. I think it was 84. Saying that by the year 2000, entire nations would be underwater if we didn't do something about climate change. 1984. Yeah. Good God. I mean, almost half a century ago.
Apparently it was prior to the 60s, much more of a conservative thing than a leftist thing. Right. And that after the 60s, the left got their hands on it and started pushing it. I'm not saying that is the case. I think it's plausible from my skim reading of it. I got that one from Ben Pyle over at Spiked. That was his thing, and I think it's certainly plausible from what I've seen so far. But certainly today, it's primarily driven by the left.
Well, I think James Delingpole, and I haven't read the book, but his book on the subject, which is a brilliant title. And I've forgotten the title. What's it called? Watermelons, yeah. Green on the outside and red on the inside. I think there's a lot to that. So it seems the one thing the left do so well and the right are terrible at is adopting a problem or a victim or a cause, and then they squeeze what they can out of it, and then they move on. I mean, this whole turf thing at the moment with radical feminists. Now, you couldn't have got any more lefty than radical feminists, Germaine Greer and people like that 30 years ago.
Suzanne Moore and people like that.
Yeah. And then now they're persona non grata because they've been dumped now by the left because they're no longer useful anymore. So they've now moved on to this whole trans debate, which is, another level of madness. But
literally, literally madness. Until yesterday, it was widely accepted by the experts, and aren't we supposed to listen to the experts, that transgenderism is a mental disorder. Now, just by saying that aloud, I mean, I don't care. They can come and give me shit if they want. It won't end well for them if they do. You're not supposed to say that kind of thing. Apparently, you're not allowed to say that. It was a fact until yesterday.
Yeah.
And I'm still waiting for the evidence that something's changed.
Well, I think this is where, and I've read some of Douglas Murray's work on this, and which is very good. But I think this, and this is not necessarily what he said, but interpolating what he said, I think a large part of this postmodernistic thing is that they basically deconstruct everything till nothing makes sense. That seems to be my rudimentary understanding of this whole postmodernism approach. Seems to be that you take everything apart until there's no truth anywhere. You can have your own truth, as they say, and that's why I think words are so important, and that's why I will keep saying, if you've got a penis, you're a man. And I'm sorry if that's radical. Well, tough. Because, and I mean, the point is, we are skating there. By saying that, you are skating on real legal. I mean, that could be, you could be hoisted up and not even be told, but you could be reported, as I understand it, for a hate crime for saying that, or was it a non-crime hate incident? Certainly, if you were to be nasty to somebody and tell them they were a man when they thought they were a woman, that would definitely be a non-crime hate incident. But I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to be nasty to somebody who I've got no interest in what they are or think they want to be, or who they sleep with, or what they do in their private time. But at the same time, no, the biological reality is that if you've got a penis, you're a man. And no one's going to make me say anything any different to that.
This is something I don't think I've heard anyone else say. It's a tool for implementing cadre deployment. So in South Africa, after the ANC took power, they swept out all the white devils from positions of power within the civil service, like running waterworks and things like that. Mm-hmm. And they put people who were loyal to the ANC and black, obviously, mm-hmm. Into positions of power in those places. It's called cadre deployment.
Right.
What I think happens with this stuff, this mad ideology, is that it's used to ensure that those that get into power are on side, or at least will toe the party line. So today, if you want to go into politics, look at the stuff with Starmer recently and others, where he was on Andrew Maher, wasn't he? And he was asked about uteruses or something. I can't remember what the hell it
cervix,
was.
Wasn't it? Yeah,
cervix, right.
Yeah.
It's a way of making sure only the right people get into positions of power. Because today, if you don't toe the party line on transgenderism, two of us haven't got a hope.
No.
We would be, if either of us tried to get into politics today, if we were to run and we were to get enough money to run, we would be immediately, they would churn up this podcast. They would dig it up.
Pretty damning. Yeah, absolutely.
Pretty damning, and they would look at tweets, and they would establish that we had, rubbed up against progressive ideology on a variety of fronts, and it would be used to tag us as haters, because to be a hater in our society basically means you disagree with progressives. So it immediately filters out anyone who might be problematic, to use a disgusting sociological term. So yeah, I think that's what it's used for, and I think that's what it's primarily used for. I think it's cadre deployment.
Interesting. Makes a lot of sense. I mean, and yes, I haven't applied for a job for a very long time, but I'm trying to think. Whenever you fill in a census was probably the most recent thing that I filled in that was formal, and I mean, the way that they tiptoed around that with what is your sex, and then it says, oh, by the way, don't feel that you have to put male or female, because you'll have an opportunity later to say what gender you think you are. And it's like, oh, for God's sake, just, it's their desperate way. They need real information so they can supposedly plan for the future in their census, but at the same time they're so weak that they can't say, well, that's the reality. They have to placate everybody by saying, oh no, okay, well, what's your sex? Okay, we've got the real information. Now, do you think you're a unicorn? It makes me sick. It's just stupidity. But anyway, we are of the same mind, I think, on that. So we've been going for a couple of hours, so we've gone further than we thought we were going to do. But I think it's been a really, I've certainly enjoyed the conversation, and you have opened my eyes to a few things, not least reminded me to go and read Ben Irvin's essay, because I'm very aware of him saying it, and the whole union power dynamic, but it's not something I've looked in great detail, because I've been largely more worried about the the coordinated attack on free speech and free movement and free and liberties generally in the general world. Before we start to think about winding things up, to get back to what everyone's been talking about for the last 18 months, 2 years, I don't intend to go big into vaccination passports here, but lockdown. So where do you think we are with lockdowns? Given that, just to set this up, I was thinking about this earlier, if the unions and every other organ of the state or the establishment is desperate to push us into a lockdown, and we've got, I think, probably one of the most cowardly or impotent prime ministers of recent times, and that's saying something given the competition. Where do you think, what do you think is going to happen in terms of lockdown between now and Christmas?
I think that we will have a medium rare lockdown imposed on us. I don't think we're going to have the full shebang. I think we will have, as far as I'm concerned, the lockdown's never ended since March 2020, because for me the lockdown is the Coronavirus Act 2020.
Yeah.
That's the mechanism that exerts lockdown to lesser and greater extent upon the country and its economy. We will have some restrictions placed on us for sure, because at the end of the day, Sage, all the media, the unions as described, most politicians are sort of some form of socialist and in favor of this stuff. So it's kind of inevitable. There's only a handful of people with platforms or in Parliament who are against it. So, what do you do? How do you stop it? All you can do is try and minimize the impact. Remember that the Tory party exists to, in its own mind, hold power.
Yeah.
And it's the most successful political party in human history, I think, pretty much, if you use obvious measurements. Immensely successful organization. I'll never vote for them again, but that's not the point I'm making here. They're immensely powerful, immensely intelligent, and they exist to hold power. And they will be thinking about the next election, and they will know that the state of the economy, for example, among other things, will largely determine how that election goes. So do they want another lockdown? Do you think that Boris Johnson and Sajid Javid, listen to Sajid Javid and things that he's saying at the moment, sage nudge theory stuff aside, and I do think that that's going on. You believe that they want to shut this economy down, that they want to do these things? I don't know. I don't know. I really don't. And they do look to be engaged in conflict with the Guardianistas and the rest of them. And remember, that is, Whitty and Valance and most of Sage, are of that persuasion, although even they seem a little bit more moderate than the media and the media spokespeople right now. So yeah, I think we're headed for some restrictions for sure. But I just hope that people of our persuasion can see that this is from top to bottom a leftist drive for power in the world, and in our own country, and that once we recognize that and start talking about it, maybe we can change things.
Well, I don't. I certainly. I've always been of the view that, I think that the Great Reset, which obviously a large number of people around our sort of team, if you like, talk about. I definitely that's leftist anyway. I think there's just total overlap, and I'm more than happy to. I'm open to this whole drive that domestically, perhaps that's the way to attack. But I tell you what, my biggest concern is really, well, I've got lots of concerns. Vaccine passport being a very big one because of where I think it leads. But you said, do you think they want to sort of close the economy again? And my worry is, especially given Bill Gates turned up the other day, and I think I tweeted out that why does everyone think that? Why does everyone think he's come to see Boris? Because what if it's more to do with the Chancellor? Not because Bill's going to bail anybody out, but because he's obviously part of this. If you say he's part of this WEF thing, but
he would need to. He would. If he was there to bail anyone out, he would need to dig a lot deeper.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that he is going to stick his hand in his pocket. But
this government, this is something that people need to keep in mind. This government, if it persuaded Bill Gates to bankroll it for 3 days, it would bankrupt Bill Gates.
Yeah, we're trillions. At 1 point, just over. It's about 1.2 trillion or something we've got now in debt. Is this? It's huge. I know. We're about 100%.
If you factor in public sector liabilities and pensions and so forth, it's more like 4 trillion.
Yeah, but every government pretty much. I think they were saying Japan is at 4.5 times GDP. Japan's debt. America is at 3, and they want to borrow another 2 trillion or 3 trillion. So this is my worry, is that everyone, the thesis that's been put out on podcasts and on programs that I've seen, is that since 2008 everybody has realised that we're screwed, and rather than have, whilst it was unpleasant at the time and didn't help me much financially at the time, the big bang hasn't really happened, the big collapse, and that they are now managing this monetary collapse, this economic collapse, and then what will happen in its place will be this new central bank digital currency. So that the whole point of the Great Reset being, oh shit, everything's gone to hell, we're going to have to reset everything. And then you've got linked to that, levelling up, stakeholder capitalism, making sure everybody gets their fair share. It's not just the shareholders of a business that should benefit with profit, it should be the community, it should be the nation, it should be the world, it should be green, it should be, then the green thing becomes we've got to do this because it's green and it helps people, people aren't going to drown in Bangladesh because we've given them £500 billion or whatever it is. So I think it's all linked. I think there is an argument that says it's all linked, and my concern is that what's going to happen, and the reason perhaps that the likes of Bill Gates and his pals were here, was just a bit of a check-in to see how it's going with the new digital currency, which was only announced by Rishi Sunak about a day or two before Bill Gates arrived. Even though everyone knew it was going to happen for a long time. But so,
what I struggle with here is I've heard the same from others. Tim Price, for example.
Yes, I heard it from him. Yeah,
and I don't disagree with much of it necessarily. I think that significant parts of it are independent of other parts. You know, the idea that it's all orchestrated from top to bottom, for me, I find to be, I'll be frank, I find it economically illiterate, and I think it's just not true. Doesn't mean that there are not people trying to influence things, nudge things in certain directions, and all the rest of it. But what's being described is very clearly a modern version of global communism, Trotskyism.
Yeah.
And yet, day in, day out, I have to suffer people saying it's not a left versus right thing. It's freedom versus authoritarianism.
Right.
This sort of, or I heard of one prominent person recently to turn around and say, left-right politics is over. What a load of shite, ignorant nonsense. It's obviously what we're dealing with here is a continuation of a project which largely got underway in the French Revolution, and it is you know, it's from Robespierre to the modern day. It's obvious that that's what's going on, and people don't want to confront it. Look, Confucius said the best way to deal with an unhealthy polity is to start calling things by their proper names, and we need to start doing that. We need to recognize that it's central planners, it's people who want resources to be controlled by third parties. It's people who think that individuals should not be in control of their own lives, and that their lives should be determined by clever, credentialed people in government departments. Socialism.
Yes,
that's what we're fighting, and very, very, very few people in the lockdown movement are willing to say that out loud. I wonder if it's the same thing that's what's going on with the Islam issue. They're scared of confrontation. They don't want to call things by the proper name. Consequently, maybe they know some people who are on the left or socialists. I know people on the left and socialists who I like very much. But I have no problem saying that they're wrong. And I think we all need to do that.
That's interesting. Well, I mean, that's helped me distill actually in my head, because I definitely, this is why with Ben talking about what he's been talking about, it's never seemed to me to be a problem that I could accept that. Yes, because I have long since thought that it's a socialist agenda that's being pushed by the Great Reset. And I also, just to clarify, with the likes of Bill Gates turning up, I don't think that Bill Gates is like I don't think he's the guy with the white cat that's orchestrating everything. I just think he's a useful element of it that overlaps various bits. I'm not saying that he's coming and giving instructions to the British government, for example, which some people say. So I don't think, just to clarify, I don't think that's the case. I think he has interests which he's very happy to promote worldwide. But in terms of this, what you've just said about socialism, I mean, I think the cultural revolution that we're going through as well, I think Pol Pot and Mao I think we're very much there, really, in terms of, I think that is, I find that terrifying. I think that's where we are going. And I think, if you were saying, I've got no argument with you when it comes to saying it's driven by the left. I mean, do you think the reason that people have said there's no left, there's no right now, and I've probably said this myself, actually, there's authoritarianism versus individualism or individual rights, is because there are people on the left and the right that have come down on different sides of this, what's happening. So you see what I mean?
It's a confusion of, so we've got general and absolute truths, and unfortunately a lot of people have this, Thomas Sowell calls it in Vision of the Anointed, all or nothing thinking. So if I say that the sky is blue, if you're being reasonable, you'll say, well, that's a fair statement, right? But someone who is trying to make that, someone who finds it inconvenient that the sky is blue will come back and say, oh, but hang on a minute, that cloud up there is white. Or if I say that the ocean is made of water, someone who finds that statement inconvenient will come back and say, "Oh, but the submarine's not made of water," right? So,
Yep.
when I say that the whole COVID tyranny is left wing, it's a generally true statement. It doesn't mean that there aren't some people who identify as left wing. Some trade unions, for example, there's a trade union in France that's been opposing vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. Doesn't mean that there are not exceptions. It just means that it is generally true that most people, most organizations that are leftist are, if not in support of it, behind this stuff. It also, let's not forget, it originated in communist China. It's been promoted, the World Health Organization, the United Nations. What could be more leftist than an organization that puts human rights abusers from banana republics in Africa on an equal footing with advanced liberal democracies? What could be more leftist than that?
Yes.
It is generally true that it is left wing. Yeah.
I mean, the whole Bezmenov, you'll know of Yuri Bezmenov and his talks in the 80s and early 90s, I think, to audiences in the States about how Russia and the USSR were undermining and demoralizing the West. I mean, whether that's all still linked or whether it's overlapped with it, I don't know, but it all seems to make perfect sense to me that all of that has happened. And we just seem very sick. I think the West is very sick at the moment and weak.
He would have, Yuri Bezmenov would have people who turn around and say things like, "Oh, left-right politics is not a thing anymore, and it's not about left and right; it's about freedom and authoritarianism." Those kinds of people coming out with sort of mimsy, woolly statements like that, Bezmenov would have called them fodder. Is what he would have called them, fodder. People who would have been the day after the revolution put against walls and shot. That's what he would have said about them. I'm very familiar with Yuri Bezmenov. He was brilliant. His the small amount of stuff that we have left from him is very valuable and worth a look.
It is. Well, if anybody listening to this, I think probably most people have seen some at least of his talks and what have you, but he's well worth. I mean, it's pretty frightening when you look at what the plan was, and you look at where we are now. You go, well, we're well advanced through it. I mean, well, I can't say that I disagree with anything really there, Ronan, that you said, and I will. I think my biggest concern from all of this now is really how we get out of it, because, as I say, I don't think that Boris Johnson is the man of the hour. I think he's weak, and I would say that he personifies political cowardice. So he's no Margaret Thatcher when it comes to dealing with the unions, and I think even if you had somebody as motivated as someone like Margaret Thatcher, who was determined to see it through, like with the miners' strike or the Falklands War, the problem is that even she, I don't think at the moment, would be able to do anything much about it, because we're in such a weak position, and globally there's so much happening globally. So I'm afraid I can't leave anybody, unless you've got some golden bullet, I can't really leave anybody at the end of this podcast with too much in the way of positivity. But we can't give up, can we? We've got to keep going.
So to refer back to a couple of things in the conversation we just had, if you accept that governments and states sort of blow with the wind to a certain extent, which they have to do if they want to remain in power and not be removed in a revolution. You have to reflect, especially the young people's views. That tells you that public awareness is extremely important. So, what can we do? Make the public aware that the unions are driving a lot of this stuff. And they're not just driving it around COVID, they're also stopping transport, that they are stopping shoe factories from making shoes, that they are stopping the DVLA from printing driving licenses, because they're only sending, because the union, only half the staff are in the DVLA office in Swansea.
Yep.
If we can make the public aware that these things are going on, and that the media is working with them, and that's the Guardian and the BBC, which are organisations that are one and the same. Mm-hmm. You could argue that the BBC is basically the public-funded broadcast wing of the Guardian newspaper.
Yeah.
The Times, Sky, all of them, virtually all of them anyway, are implementing, promoting, peddling the union's line. If the public can be made aware of that, we can start to get the people that are in power to do something about it. I agree that Johnson, Fat Blair as I call him, is a sort of, he's a pretty weak man. I mean, that's obvious by his infidelities, isn't it? You can tell that he's driven by, he likes pleasure. I can't begrudge him that, to be fair. But nevertheless, he's a pretty weak guy. Margaret Thatcher, on the other hand, was far more disciplined, and I think he's an intelligent guy. There's no doubt about it. But she was really bright. People forget that she was. She'd read all the great economic texts from back to front many times. She had a first, was it, from Oxford in applied chemistry or something mental. Yeah, so he's an incredibly intelligent person. And Johnson, Fat Blair, call him what you like. He's not stupid as an intelligent man, but he's not on that level. Milton Friedman said that we shouldn't wait. Milton Friedman was a guy worth listening to. He said that we shouldn't wait for the right leaders to be in power to bring things about that we want. That we should create the circumstances where the wrong people, because it'll always be the wrong people, do the things that we want. So we've got Johnson, we've got Sajid Javid, we've got these people. That's what we've got for the next couple of years. We have to work with that because there's no other alternative. The alternative is Keir Starmer or whoever it is, or maybe even worse, maybe what's that gobby brummy called, Jess Phillips or one of the others there, right? Angela, but most Rayner likely, Angela Rayner or actually maybe Andy Burnham. Yeah. We've got Johnson. That's what we've got to work with. That's where we're at. So we've got to find ways to make it work for the cause of freedom.
Well, that's a good way to end it, I think. Thank you, Ronan, for I think you've nicely brought things into focus there. So I think there's a lot for people to think about. Before we disappear, as I said at the beginning, you're the editor of Samizdat Magazine. What's the URL for that if people wanted to look it up?
So the website is being developed as we speak, although there is still stuff there for you to go and see. And it is, you can get the first three issues of the magazine. It is at samizdatmagazine.co.uk. That's SAMIZDAT magazine.co.uk. And you can follow us on Twitter at Samizdat Mag, capital Samizdat, capital Mag.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed this chat. You have managed to distill quite a few things in my head and also teach me a few things along the way. You've obviously done a lot of reading into this side of stuff, and it's obvious when you start talking to you. So I really appreciate your time. Ronan Maher, editor of Samizdat Magazine, thank you very much, and hope we can speak again soon.
Sam, pleasure was all mine. Thank you.